also at service in the State Department, CIA, which we've wrangled with every once in a while with that thing. So he's our resident spook, analyst spook.
Thank you.
He is widely published and a thoughtful and provocative thinker. Human Maj is a very good friend. Human arranged for me to join a dinner in New York some years ago when President Khatami came, and I'm still in his debt. That was one of the most intriguing encounters I've had on the Iran front. He's the author of the highly acclaimed The Ayatollah Begs to Differ. He helped organize and put together President Khatami's entire trip when they visited here, as well as current President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and was, on the cool side of his portfolio, Executive Vice President of Island Records. And he also publishes in the places like GQ and Vanity Fair and the places that we wonks have a hard time getting into. Barbara Slavin, who has an important piece on the Washington Note today, I hope you will pick it up. Barbara is former assistant managing editor for World and National Security at the Washington Times, the author of the very important 2000 book on Iran entitled Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the United States, and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. And as I said earlier, she was senior diplomatic editor for USA Today, not U.S. News and World Report, my error. Very, very good friend, and I very much appreciate all of you being here today. Let's start with Flint to throw the first arrows, and I will certainly entice a feisty debate, and I promised we'll get to everyone. And you can be as animated as you like when we get to the next section.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be at this podium. Before I talk directly about the polls we've just seen presented and what I think they mean for our understanding of Iranian politics and what that in turn should imply for U.S. policy, I want to take a little trip down memory lane and take you all back to the days in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Think back to those days in 2002 into 2003, when the American public, and indeed publics around the world, were exposed to a concerted effort by the U.S. government and its partners to build up public support for a campaign of coercive regime change in Iraq. The U.S. and British governments proclaimed with seemingly absolute certainty that Saddam Hussein's regime had stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons and had reconstituted its nuclear weapons program. The Iraqi government had close links to al-Qaeda. How did our governments know these things? Well, they had intelligence, or so they said. But when you look back at some of the intelligence estimates that were produced in the United States before the war, those footnotes from the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department that challenged consensus judgments across the rest of the community that aluminum tubes and other suspicious items had to have been imported into Iraq for nuclear or biological weapons programs, those dissenting footnotes seem pretty smart analysis in hindsight. But they were roundly dismissed at the time. Indeed, there were INR analysts who had to leave their jobs at the State Department, in some cases after years of service to their country. Those who questioned the intelligence case for going to war had their patriotism and basic moral integrity called into question. But in the end, the quality of our intelligence really didn't matter all that much, because after the government and their followers in the media and think tank echo chambers had pushed the Bush administration's bottom line judgments, people just knew that Saddam had nuclear weapons and supported al-Qaeda. We all just knew it. Those judgments fit with all of our assumptions about Saddam and his regime. Those pesky INR footnotes created cognitive dissonance, which is usually a pretty unpleasant experience for most people. Well, as Yogi Berra famously said, it's deja vu all over again. Once again, media and foreign policy elites are telling us with confidence that the Iranian election was a fraud, the results could not possibly reflect the sentiments of the Iranian people, that a mass movement has risen in response to that fraud, which is marshaling the deep antipathy that most Iranians feel toward their current political order, and in the end will sweep away the Islamic Republic, in the process providing the greatest boost to the American strategic position in the Middle East since the end of the Cold War. How do these elites know these things? Well, it's obvious. Must be. Western journalists who went and hung out in North Tehran came back convinced that Mousavi must surely have won the election. It's rather like my mother-in-law in Brooklyn, who in 2004 could not believe that George W. Bush had really won re-election because she literally didn't know anyone who had voted for him. Even if she expanded her focus to take in her friends on the Upper West Side in Manhattan, she still didn't know anybody who had voted for George W. Bush. How could he have won? Surely something was fishy somewhere. But the United States is a big country, and it's certainly bigger than Brooklyn or the Upper West Side. Iran's not as big a country as the United States, but it's still pretty big, and it's certainly bigger than North Tehran. The presentation today, the polls that our University of Maryland colleagues have reviewed here, I'll say this, I don't know if they'll be comfortable with my saying, but I'm going to say it. I think these polls are analogous to those INR footnotes that cost some very good intelligence analysts and career civil servants their jobs. Analysts and civil servants who both at the time and in retrospect were right in their judgments when literally everyone else around them was dead wrong. What we've been able to see today is competent professionals looking at the best data available to them and coming to professional judgments as to what those data mean. And those data and the analysis of the data presented here today suggest very strongly that the official election results from the June 2009 presidential election are quite consistent with Iranian public opinion. Now, as Steve Cull said, these polls don't in any way rule out the possibility of electoral fraud or irregularities. Our colleagues cannot and would not say there was no fraud. I have never argued that there was no fraud in the Iranian election. I am hardly in a position to vouch for the integrity with which Iranian ballot boxes were handled. But what I have argued and continue to argue is that no evidence of fraud, evidence as opposed to conjecture, supposition, it must have been kinds of statements, no evidence has been advanced, and as I just said, these polls indicate that the election results are very consistent with our best, most data-based reading of Iranian public sentiment. I would also go on to say that I don't believe that the Green Movement represents a majority of the Iranian public. We can discuss that in the Q&A. And I certainly don't believe that the Islamic Republic of Iran is in danger of collapse or implosion. We can also discuss that if you like. The discussion of Iranian domestic politics here in the United States since Iran's election last year, I think underscores how fundamentally warped our broader discussion of Iran-related issues is. Let me cite a comparative case to illustrate the point. Right next door to Iran in Afghanistan, there was also a presidential election last year. We don't have to surmise or assume that there was massive electoral fraud in that Afghan election. We know it. We know it because Afghan and international election officials told us so after reviewing hard evidence about how the election was conducted, ballots counted, etc. This was fraud to a point where what had been declared an outright victory for Hamid Karzai was changed to, well, we're going to need a runoff here. And when Abdullah decided to withdraw from the runoff, arguing that there couldn't possibly be a fair election under present circumstances in Afghanistan, the Obama administration couldn't move fast enough to declare that everything was fine, this had all been done in accordance with Afghanistan's wonderful constitution, and isn't it fantastic that Afghanistan now has a legitimate government? Now, never mind that the Obama administration had spent its first 6 months in office with Special Envoy Richard Holbrooke in the lead, trying to dump Karzai, the now legitimately re-elected president of Afghanistan. The sheer diplomatic incompetence of this administration never fails to amaze. But I digress. The main point here is that the discussion of Iranian domestic politics here in the United States, I would argue, is not about trying to reach a better understanding of what is actually happening inside the Islamic Republic, any more than our reaction to electoral shenanigans in Afghanistan was driven by some high-minded impulse on the Obama administration's part to understand what was really going on there. The largely fact-free discussion of Iranian domestic politics here in the United States is fundamentally a reflection of our inability here to recognize Iran's substantially increased strategic importance, to recognize America's need for a constructive relationship, strategic relationship with Iran, with all that implies about the relative decline of U.S. power and influence in one of the world's most critical regions, and to deal with Iran as it is and not as some Americans might wish it to be. And if that doesn't change, we could well end up with a policy outcome toward Iran that is even more damaging for long-term U.S. interests in the Middle East than I believe was the case with the decision to invade Iraq. Now, just to conclude here, a couple of other arguments I would like to take on. One is that, well, since the election, whatever happened, Iran is too conflicted today to be engaged by the United States. I would simply say again, what's your evidence for that? Political controversy in Iran is not something new. Dissension among the elite in Iran is not something new. And in fact, since June 2009, the government in Tehran has taken a lot of decisions, both domestically and in foreign policy. We may not like some of the decisions they've taken, but that they are capable of taking decisions and acting on the basis of those decisions. And even if you somehow think that this government is too conflicted to deal effectively with the United States, well, shouldn't you ought to at least test that proposition and not just assume it? Second argument I want to take on is that this government is too ideologically anti-American, or that, more particularly, that there's something about President Ahmadinejad, that he's too ideological, too anti-Israeli, too hardline, too this or that, to be a serious negotiating partner for the United States. I'm happy to talk more about Ahmadinejad and his views on foreign policy and why I think it's going to be important to engage the system in Iran, and that system is going to include its elected president. But let me just end with another historical analogy. In the early 1970s, Anwar Sadat was widely viewed in Egypt as well as abroad as an extremely weak, not very capable leader. He was widely derided in Egypt at the time of his succession as Nasser's poodle, the wholly inadequate successor to the great man who had preceded him as president of Egypt. He was, in his attitudes, anti-Israel. He could be quite anti-Semitic, rhetorically. And he launched an aggressive war against Israel in 1973 to avenge Egypt's defeat in the 1967 war. But Sadat was open to strategic realignment with the United States. And that realignment and the Camp David peace accord that facilitated has been not just an enormous boon to the United States' position in the region, it is the biggest boon to Israel's position in the region since the founding of the State of Israel. It took Egypt out of the Arab-Israeli military picture and made a generalized Arab-Israeli war of the sort that we had seen previously in 73, 67, and before that. It has rendered that impossible. Think about what a U.S.-Iranian breakthrough would mean for the United States. Think about what it would mean for stability of this critical region. And then ask yourselves what you really know about Iranian domestic politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Clint. Human Maj. Yes, you're good at
that. I'm not as well prepared as Flint, mainly because I don't, specifically with regard to the polls, I have no knowledge of polls, really, I'll admit that. And I don't know how they work. I don't know that they're real. Oftentimes I don't believe them. In the case, I'll just briefly say my thoughts on the polling data. I would personally throw out the University of Tehran poll, not because it is automatically incorrect, but because nobody in Iran would accept that the government would allow a poll to be published by the University of Tehran, even if it were by people on their side, but was reflecting something that the government did not want reflected. In other words, there are elements, I agree with the pollsters, that there are elements in that poll which are some kind of tough questions that some Iranians seem to have answered. But people are not going to believe, the government would not have allowed, I do actually believe this, that the Iranian government would not have allowed that poll to be published by the University of Tehran if it showed that the majority of people did not vote for Ahmadinejad, for example. Now, that doesn't mean that the majority of people didn't vote for Ahmadinejad. I don't know that answer. My own sense was, like Steve Clemens' sense, and here I disagree with Flint a little bit on this, my own sense was that Mousavi was in a very good position to, at a minimum, force the elections into a second round. I was there during the campaign. I wasn't there for the actual day of the elections. I left Tehran a week before, hoping to go back for the second round. The Green Movement at that point was not yet the Green Movement, but the Mousavi people told me not to bother because they were going to win. This was a week before the election. And of course, the Ahmadinejad people said, don't bother because we're going to win. It's hard to say. I mean, Iran is a very difficult country to analyze. It's difficult for Iranians, let alone for people who aren't Iranian. None of us really have all the answers, I think, but the point that Steve brings up and the point that Flint brought up, it's very important in terms of how we view Iran. It is important to not be emotional from the perspective of America, from the perspective of the American government. It's important to not be emotional and not to be caught up in the domestic affairs of Iran when thinking about whether to engage Iran, whether to engage them on the nuclear issue, or any of those things. I think some of the data in the polls seem to be accurate based on what I've experienced in terms of, in all the polls, in terms of the general support in Iran for the nuclear program, even in general support for nuclear weapons. This happens to me all the time and whenever I'm in Iran and I ask people about the nuclear program, and sometimes people volunteer to me, why shouldn't we have the bomb? So I think that is actually quite accurate, that there is a sense among some people, who knows what the percentages are, that Iranians do feel like they're being unfairly singled out. And specifically, the question usually is, why shouldn't we have the bomb if Israel has the bomb? That's usually what I've heard from Iranians. One of the problems with the polling, and I think one of the gentlemen who asked a question earlier in Iran, is that Iranians are famous for not telling the truth to strangers. I hate to say this, but we're very suspicious of people calling us at home. And like Steve Clemens, who must be an honorary Iranian, we don't generally we aren't generally respondents to polls. I think the NIAC actually said and is worried about this, National Iranian American Council, that in the last census, Iranians were very undercounted, Iranian Americans, because even those who live in America are suspicious of somebody coming and asking them questions. So the NIAC has got this big program to try to convince Iranians it's okay to answer a government census poll taker. It's, you're not going to be deported or whatever. Or your bank accounts aren't going to be checked if you do respond. So I think that is an important factor when talking about polling in Iran. Polling has never been viewed as at least by, and again, I'm not speaking as a polling expert or a statistician, but has never been viewed by anybody as being particularly accurate. I can give a couple of examples of how the people that I know in Iran who, and I'll preface this by saying that I am related to former President Khatami, and therefore, by definition, I guess I'm kind of green. But or at least that's the assumption. And I am. I voted for Mousavi. I'm sympathetic to Khatami and Mousavi and to Karoubi as well. The way that the Iranian opposition to Ahmadinejad were figuring out where they were in the polls, or where they stood in the weeks before the election, was not by scientific polls or scientific by the standards of American scientific polls. They had their own workers who were campaigning, canvassing their own neighborhoods, and you could argue that being biased, they're likely to talk to people who are biased as well. So again, as I say, it's not scientific, but that was the basis under which they were coming up with numbers as to where they stood. What is interesting is the pre-election polls, and I've said this to Flint before, the pre-election polls indicating the most accurate ones that were scientific ones that were indicating that Ahmadinejad was going to win by 60% or more, which was about a month before the elections themselves, a little bit less than a month before the elections themselves. Those were actually accurate to the extent that the opposition themselves had the same numbers coming back from their people. So they felt not very confident a month before the elections, as indicated by the polls that we've referred to. But their canvassing and their numbers were changing, and it's indicated, to be fair, in these polls up until June 1st, and then we see a drop-off. There will be disagreements as to whether Ahmadinejad won the debate, because that is kind of a turning point, certainly in terms of the polling data that we saw, or whether Mousavi won it or if it was a tie. My own personal view, it was closer to a tie than anything else. But when we're talking about what do Iranians think, it's very, very difficult. I mean, it's very important from the perspective, I agree with Flynn, it's very important from the perspective of the American government to try to ascertain what the Iranian people think, in the same way that it was important, but they didn't do this, to try to find out what the Iraqi people thought before the invasion of Iraq, or what the Afghans indeed thought before what we're doing there. So it is important in terms of American foreign policy, but I maintain that it's still going to be very, very difficult to ascertain what Iranians think based on polls. That, I think, is going to be practically impossible. Certainly with the kind of polls that we have available to us, there's all kinds of reasons why Iranians will argue with you, Steve, about whether calling from outside the country is an advantage or a disadvantage, whether there are Iranian agents who are in the middle of this, or people's phones are tapped. And there's all kinds of reasons why many Iranians won't respond well to polls, or won't respond to the results of polls and agree with them, apart from the University of Tehran issue, which I think that is just a basic automatic. I mean, I know that if the University of Tehran, which has actually made it public, presented this to the opposition movement, they would disagree with it and say, well, that's obvious, it's the University of Tehran. But I don't know how much time. I don't want to take too much time. I just wanted to make those few points before I sit down and say it is very difficult to understand what the Iranian people our thinking. It's almost impossible without actually being there and then traveling around the country, talking to all kinds of people, which we Iranians are sometimes guilty of not doing. We tend to focus in on our friends. It's all about your peers. If all your peers believe that Mousavi won the election, then you'd be very, very quickly convinced that he did. And yet, if you go and talk to a lot of Ahmadinejad supporters, you might be convinced that he won the election. There's been a lot of, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes, on both sides of the equation. I think that that's something to be considered in terms of the Iranian people when we think about where to go. Sorry if I.
No, come on. Thank you so much. That was excellent. Barbara Slavin, please.
Thanks to the New America Foundation. Thanks to Steve. I'm a last-minute addition here, and I'm going to just give a couple of observations based on what we've heard. I would agree that polling is a very inexact science all over the world, but particularly in Iran. And I think it's important that we don't read too much into these numbers. The main problem I think we have with all these surveys is that they stop in September. And a great deal has happened since then. It almost doesn't matter whether there was fraud, how great the fraud was. Since June the 12th, and in particular in the last few months, we have seen increasing repression by the Iranian government. And this is changing the reality of the country that we are dealing with. We have had massive demonstrations starting with June 15th when something like 3 million people came out on the streets of Tehran. We've seen a pattern of Iranians using official holidays to come out and show their opposition to the government. We've had the subversion of days like Students' Day, of the annual commemoration of the takeover of the U.S. Embassy. I think we really crossed an important red line with Ashura, which is the most important holiday for Shiite Muslims. It took place on December 27th this year, and there were violent clashes. Even under the Shah and during the revolution, he ordered his military not to shoot at the crowds during Ashura. Well, that happened this year, and it antagonized a number of people. When the Green Movement began, it was primarily secular. It was very young, student-driven. After Ashura and after the regime's ham-handed attempts to stop protests after the death of Ayatollah Montazeri, the most prominent dissident cleric, you saw an involvement among Shia clerics as well, becoming involved in the Green Movement in a more obvious way. This is something that it's moving, it's changing, it's growing, it's expanding as we speak. And if you were to take a poll now, if you could take an accurate poll now, I think you might have some different findings. I have a lot of respect for Flint and for Hilary Mann. They were very helpful when I was writing my book. I've been a long proponent of engagement with Iran. I continue to be. I think that some major opportunities were missed under the Bush administration in particular, before Ahmadinejad came into office, and after Ahmadinejad was elected. And I do believe that Ahmadinejad actually would like to be, if not the Nixon, then the Mao, that he would like to be able to deliver an agreement, a breakthrough with the United States, because it would bolster him, it would make him be seen as a successful president. I don't think he's being seen that way now by most Iranians. But we cannot ignore the reality on the ground, the fact that things have changed, the fact that this regime, which has always been rough, has become incredibly brutal. Thousands jailed, hundreds tried in show trials, people raped in prison, 2 young men executed last week who had both committed whatever offenses they had committed before the elections, but were made to give false confessions, were conflated with the opposition protests after the elections, and were hung last week as a warning to Iranians not to come out and protest on February 11th, which is the day when the regime commemorates the success of the 1979 revolution. This is going to be another occasion for massive protests and clashes between the Green opposition and the government. So I think, Flint makes a lot of analogies. No analogy really works. This isn't Iraq We're not saying that Iran has weapons and that they're going to attack us. Nobody with a brain is advocating attacking Iran now, although there may still be some who think that you could go in and get rid of the nuclear program and that this would somehow be a solution. I certainly would say that is a very foolish idea and would strengthen the most authoritarian aspects of that government. It's, to compare Ahmadinejad with Sadat, I don't know who would be more offended. I'm sure Ahmadinejad would not appreciate the comparison, given his feelings about Israel. It's Iran, okay? It's not any other case. What should the U.S. government do? Well, I think the U.S. government's been doing a pretty good job of extending the offer of engagement. Certainly, President Obama did more than anyone previous to him in offering greetings to the people of the country on Persian New Year, referring constantly to the Islamic Republic of Iran, its official name, sending 2 letters to Supreme Leader Khamenei, which I reported in the Washington Times over the summer. He has done everything possible. It seemed in October that there might actually be a deal, not quite the deal that Steve Cull talked about. The Iranians are not agreeing to suspend enrichment, but there was an agreement in principle to send out 2/3 of their stockpile of low-enriched uranium. Now, it was put on the table. Everyone got very excited here. Then Iran appeared to backpedal. Now, today we see Ahmadinejad has revived the offer, but nobody knows if it's for real. I think what he's mostly trying to do is stave off another round of sanctions at the UN Security Council and other unilateral sanctions that are being planned by the United States and the Europeans. I've met Ahmadinejad on numerous occasions. I'm not sure. I mean, he's a very interesting character. We can talk about his mental stability if you like, but he's a thin reed on which to base hopes for engagement. He is detested by so many members of the Iranian elite, and I'm not talking about the green opposition here now. I'm talking about the historic cleavage within the Iranian elite. I'm talking about the Speaker of Parliament, Ali Larijani, who detests Ahmadinejad and was the first to criticize this nuclear deal because Ahmadinejad pulled the rug out from under Larijani when he tried something similar in 2007. I'm talking about the Mousavis, the Hatamis, the Karubis, who are all deeply entrenched in the Islamic Republic and who despise and detest Ahmadinejad, not just because he says inflammatory and stupid things about Israel, not just because he has blown perhaps Iran's best chance for rapprochement with the United States, but because of his economic policies, which are bankrupting and destroying Iran despite its enormous oil revenues. So I think we have to go into this with a very clear-eyed fashion. The United States cannot make a revolution in Iran. If a revolution, counter-revolution, evolution, whatever it's going to be, will come from the Iranian people themselves. The U.S. can express outrage when the Iranian regime does grotesque things to its own people, and that's entirely appropriate. But no one is saying that the U.S. should not continue to offer engagement. Now, if the Iranians want to agree to send out their enriched uranium, we should open them. We should open our arms. If they'll allow us to put an interest section or an embassy back in Tehran, we should be open to this, and this will only help, I think, the process of democratization within that country. The most important finding of all the findings that Steve had, that 60% of the people were willing to say that they supported a restoration of diplomatic relations with the United States. As he mentioned, in 2002, a gentleman named Abbas Abdi did a poll that had similar results, and he was thrown in prison for a couple of years. So the fact that you can do this sort of poll and come up with this sort of result and not be thrown in prison for it, I think is a good sign. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. All right, so we've got a very fascinating discussion going on. I'd like to open up, and as you think about the many questions you have, pick your favorite, because I want folks to ask one. Identify yourself, and if you go on too long, I'm going to cut you off. But before I go to this gentleman, Matt Dust, before I go to you, I want to put one thing. I find myself very impressed with the data that Flint brings to these arguments. But let me try to approach this from a slightly different area. I've been interested for a long time in what's going on in Iran as well. But I also look at the regional aspects, and I've been interested in how, and allegedly I'm not Stephen Cull, and I have not done polling, but I have been interested in the reaction of Arab Sunni elites who have some paranoia about Iran in the region. And if, in fact, Iran was perceived to be somewhat diminished in the region, that its pretensions for what it might want to accomplish in the region that it was distracted by this internal convulsion, and that the kind of patronage and direction that Iran would, you might be able to measure it to some degree, even anecdotally, in the behavior of others. And if you talk to Arab Sunni leaders, and whether they're Saudi leaders or they're Gulf leaders, the level of I won't say contentment. They're all worried about Iran and where it's going, but they're not as worried. And that is very interesting. You would see some of the clients of Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Syria, I think perhaps move to diversify their portfolio of relationships. Now, maybe they're not causal, but I've discussed this with senior Israeli government officials who are allied with the kind of folks that I don't hang out with. They agree, for instance, that Hamas is moving more rapidly than Hezbollah and even Syria in trying to diversify its relationships for a variety of reasons. Now, maybe these are just very, very weak aspects of what may be going, and it comes to the issue not of, and I'm not trying to undermine how Flint sees the picture, and in fact, in much of the Middle East, majorities don't matter. I mean, I keep looking at Palestine and Israel, for instance, in which you've got majorities that have favored a two-state solution. Violent minorities or very focused minorities can set the terms for large others. And so one part of the question is, who cares? Maybe in fact, if there's this domestic issue and people are in the streets and there's a group of reformers who are trying to push their agenda a different way, even as a minority, let it happen. I still support engagement. Clearly, I think most of us do here. But there's another sort of respect for the notion that a minority can have an impact. Not that it will, but it could, in one sense. And then lastly, and again, I do feel like your mother-in-law in Brooklyn, perhaps, and maybe that's the explanation. But what's been very interesting, I don't have the relationships that Flint and Hillary do, or Barbara, but I have some significant relationships, and they've largely come out of the diplomatic community of Iranian diplomats stationed other ways, from very senior to mid-level to very junior. And that had been largely the source I had. So I'm getting probably a bad cross-section of the more urbane, cosmopolitan, et cetera, et cetera. But many of these people were solid supporters of Ahmadinejad and not of Khatami. And I would get lots of counseling on why my interest in your relative was so wrong-headed. And when we were beginning to sort of, look at it, and it is those people into looking at an anecdotal level after the election to see their change of their loss of faith in the government so again, it may be a Brooklyn answer and probably is, but I do want to put that on the table, that people that were solid supporters in a choice in intimate circumstances who were very well informed about this ongoing long tension among elites there, many of them, almost all of them that I know, I can't find anybody that hasn't, communicated. And they're taking some risk in communicating that to me, usually electronically. So I did want to put that on the table, see if there were any quick reactions, but then I want to open up. We'll start with Matt Duss. Did you want to react real quick to Flint and tell me where I'm wrong?
Take more questions.
Okay, Matt Duss from the Center for American Progress.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everyone, for really great presentations. Flint, I've been a long-time admirer of your analysis. I think over the past years, your pushback on some of the more fantastical presentations of the Iranian government as apocalyptic and irrational has been very, very useful. However, I think over the past months, I've tended to disagree, as I disagree a little today with your basically saying, listen, Ahmadinejad won, get over it. I think however one looks at the poll data, as Barbara said, it's become very clear that there is a vibrant and a robust civil rights movement, as Houman Majd wrote in Foreign Policy very eloquently several weeks ago, in Iran right now. And while there's certainly, I think, a realist argument to be made that the nuclear program signifies a need for some kind of deal, I think there's an equally pragmatic and realistic argument to be made that were we to use the tools available to create space, not to enlist ourselves in the green movement, but to create space for this movement to mount an Islamic and, frankly, at times, Islamist critique of the Islamic Republic in the way that a lot of clerics have come out. We've seen a lot of these protesters deploying an Islamic critique of the government and of its tyranny. For this kind of Islamic reform of the Islamic Republic to go forward, I think that could have huge implications for the Middle East and for U.S. interests there.
Thank you. Response?
Yeah, I am very interested in hearing what Human would say about the status of the Green Movement today, its agenda, and so forth. For myself, I would say with respect, I don't know what your evidence is that the Green Movement is vibrant and robust outside of Tehran, and that, in fact, the Green Movement and whatever its support base is, that its support base is actually getting bigger rather than smaller. I mean, if you have evidence of that, I would be very interested in hearing it. I could describe evidence that I think would suggest the trend is running in the opposite direction. In terms of your bigger point that there is this nuclear issue that we may need to engage them, but there's also this potential for something that from an American perspective might seem to be better to emerge in Iran. I would just, let me do another historical analogy. Nixon went to China when the Cultural Revolution was still going on. When Nixon arrived in China, the Chinese government had probably just finished presiding over the deaths of roughly 3 million of its own citizens. Mao Zedong was still in the top leadership position in Beijing. China had acquired its own nuclear weapons capability less than a decade before Nixon's visit to Beijing. Now, in retrospect, do you think that Nixon did the right thing by going to China for American interests, for international and regional stability? I believe overwhelmingly that he did. And I would make the same argument about Iran, that there are powerful American interests that can only be served by a strategic rapprochement with the Islamic Republic. And that is long overdue in American foreign policy, and it would be a real mistake for the United States to delay a strategic opening to Iran further because of what we think is going on inside Iran. On Steve's point, I would just say, at least up until last year, before the Iranian election, polls that I saw in the Arab world of who were the most popular figures, you would regularly see Hassan Nasrallah in the top spot, but you would see Ahmadinejad regularly in the number 2 or number 3 spot. I haven't seen any polls like that done since the Iranian election. One pollster that I know who regularly works in the region polling Arab publics says that his data would show that since the Iranian election there has been no real change in Arab public opinion about Iran, its place in the region, etc. Arab elites, Sunni elites, countries who decide, they're concerned about Iran, they're kind of hopeful that maybe Iran is going to get dragged down a bit by internal dissension. Wishful thinking about Iranian politics is not unique to the United States. I think the reality is that Iran remains, over the last decade, the trend has been toward very substantial increase in Iran's strategic importance in the region, and I don't think that has changed.
Barbara, did you want to respond?
Well, Flint had said that there was no evidence for demonstrations or protests outside Tehran. That's not true. There have been numerous reports from Isfahan, Shiraz, Mashhad, all over the place. I don't know the size, but this has even been reported by the wire services that are still allowed to function in Tehran. So it is not just based in Tehran. Also, there's a gentleman named Eric Hoogland. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's someone who's gone to Iran since, I think, every other year since 1973, and he was in a village outside Shiraz around the election time, and he talked about how popular Mousavi was because apparently Mousavi was the one who first put in price supports for agricultural products in Iran back in the 1980s. And he said that Mousavi had been well received there, and that during the election, apparently they took the ballot boxes away, sealed. They didn't count the votes in front of the people, which is the normal practice. So his account is one that suggests that even in the countryside, perhaps Ahmadinejad was not that popular. The other thing, I mean, again, with the historical analogies, Flint, yeah, China, Nixon, fine. This is Iran. Every situation, you can say that engagement with rogue regimes or adversaries is in general a good idea, and I believe that. I think it is a good idea. I think you put the onus on them not to engage. You don't make yourself the one, like Condi Rice used to say, you know what you should do, you know what you have to do. But it is a different situation. There was no Facebook, there was no YouTube when Mao was murdering millions of Chinese. Now we can all see Neda Aga Sultan die on the streets of Tehran. And it makes a difference. It makes a difference in terms of public opinion in this country as well as in that country. So I think we need to respect that, and we do need to be more sensitive to the human rights concerns now perhaps than we were in the past. The other thing I didn't get a chance to mention, but you talked about the coherence of the regime and so on. The regime seems very incoherent to me. I do not think they can bring themselves to accept a nuclear deal with the United States. I was very hopeful, frankly, after the meeting in Geneva between their nuclear negotiator and Bill Burns, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, that this might actually happen. But they've been all over the map about this agreement, and we don't know if they're on, they're off. And Ahmadinejad seems very isolated now when he says that they still support it. So I don't think they can deliver. It's not Mao and Zhou Enlai. If they could deliver, great. But if they can't, then what do? We don't just sit there. The U.S. needs to do something.
Let me cluster some. Human, real quickly on the health of the Green Movement, but as quickly as we can, and then we'll cluster some questions.
Right, no, just a couple of quick things, and I still live in Brooklyn, so that might color my. No, in terms
I
of the
do too.
Yeah, in terms of the nuclear agreement, I think that I actually disagree with Barbara on this in terms of whether the Iranian government would be. First of all, I'm not going to call it a regime because I guess there's a government. There's the Islamic Republic, so I'll say that this government and the Islamic Republic as a whole, I think there is a willingness to make a deal, both on the part of Ahmadinejad, and I think the Green Movement would kind of like this distraction of the nuclear issue to be gone. And they can focus in. They don't want America's help. They don't want America's support. They've made it very crystal clear, all the leaders at least of the Green Movement. The Green Movement is now turned into many different little things, but I still believe that as a movement, it's still, as a civil rights movement, the leaders are still Mousavi, Karoubi, and Khatami. The reality is that the proposal that America put forward in October in Geneva turned into a take it or leave it proposal. And the pattern for the Iranian government...
The Iranians' proposal first.
No, it wasn't.
No,
It wasn't actually, no. The Iranians did not propose that. The Iranians proposed to buy fuel initially. Then the Obama administration came up with this great kill two birds with one stone solution, which seemed a great solution. So it wasn't really an Iranian proposal. But the pattern that the Iranian government had displayed afterwards was similar to the pattern they've always displayed when it comes to international, particularly relations with the United States. I think there's always been factions that have been fighting each other. I think I agree with you on that it is incoherent in that respect. And the supreme leader's policy has always been to rule by consensus. And I think he sensed in this particular case, even if he was going to go along with Ahmadinejad at the time, that there was too much opposition to what Ahmadinejad. So I agree with you there. But I don't think that pattern is necessarily unusual in after the election. But I do agree with you also, absolutely, that we can't. I mean, it's almost a red herring to talk about the election now. And I think that the Iranians certainly, even in the statements of the leaders of the movement, they no longer really talk about the election. They really talk about civil rights, about what they're fighting for now. And of course, we could disagree on how strong they are, whether they can attract more people or not. But I do think there is some significance that for the first time since the Islamic Revolution, really for the first time, that there have been at least 2 diplomats that we know of that have resigned. And that has not happened at that level in the past whenever there's been other issues. So I think they do have the ability to attract even people inside the government to their side as a civil rights movement, not necessarily as a movement to overthrow the Islamic Republic.
So let me stop it. Let me bundle some questions here. This gentleman here again. Remember the best question you've got.
Well, actually, one comment and then
Yeah.
a question, if you don't mind.
If it's really fast.
Well,
'cause
the
we get a lot
comment
of-
is about the theme of the whole question, what do the Iranian people want? I think it's very arrogant for any of us to claim that we know what 70 million people want. And
I
the only
appreciate
way...
you thinking it's arrogant, but that's the purpose of the
No,
session.
no. Actually, I wasn't talking about you, actually.
Yeah,
Certain individuals.
Yeah.
The only way that we can find out what 70 million people want is to have a free, clean referendum to allow the people, monitored by international organizations, to tell the world that whether they want to live under a brutal theocracy or they want to live under a free, secular democracy. And until we have that, we will never know what the Iranian people want. So that's the first question. That's the first comment. The question is, Mr. Leverett, for once I actually agree with you. Ahmadinejad actually is very popular in the hardcore Islamic world. But he's a lot more popular outside Iran than he is in Iran. And the question to you is, how far do you want the United States administration to bend over backwards, to go and tolerate the Islamic Republic when the fundamental cornerstone of the survival of the Islamic Republic is antagonizing and making the United States its enemy?
Okay.
Because they know, the Islamic Republic knows that without America, the Islamic Republic is over.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm going to cluster some questions. Appreciate that. And I know you guys have some passionate moments, but we're supposed to end in 8 minutes. And so I'm going to take it a little bit longer, but I do want questions. And this is a civil discussion. Let's keep it that. This lady right here in the white.
Hi, I'm Rachel Schneller. I'm at the Council on Foreign Relations, also State Department INR officer. So thank you, Mr. Leverett, for
Footnotes.
we're
Keep those
we're
footnotes
inordinately
coming.
proud of that
We got to
footnote.
go fast.
So one of the issues that maybe we're all dancing around and that us at the Council on Foreign Relations are acutely aware of is decisions or changes of opinions by certain prominent U.S. foreign policy experts on the need for regime change in Iran and what the U.S.
Talking about Richard
roles
Haas.
might be in that. So I'd like to hear your views on that.
I want Barbara to. This is Richard's now regime change guy. Let me go. Al Fishman here.
Picking up on your comment, is whether the Green Movement, the widespread opposition to the current government, was unnecessary. It was due, the whole data suggests, to a misreading of the election. Perhaps several writers have said there were preparations for rigging the election, early reports, all this intense reaction before they knew what the returns were. So they may have set in motion a reaction much more widespread than if they had left things alone.
That's what I do when I run for office. No, I was just joking. And was there? I'm blinded up here in the lights. Was it? Is the back? No one? This lady here? Did you have your hand? Oh, this gentleman.
I'm trying to understand, going back to the poll, the consistency of the question, which got overwhelming support about allowing inspections of all nuclear facilities in Iran. This, of course, technically means reinstituting the additional protocol. And I wonder if that strong feeling is consistent with other things that the panel has brought up. For instance, people feeling strongly that Iran should have nuclear weapons, or some of the other questions asked in the poll. Could you
Thank
please
you.
explain?
So let's stop there. Reaction to Flint.
Couple of points. Look, I just fundamentally disagree with the premise that the Islamic Republic is founded on anti-Americanism. I think they come out of a history with a lot of historical baggage, antagonism towards the United States. Periodically, over the years, the Islamic Republic has cooperated tactically with the United States in a number of arenas on a number of specific issues. And each time, from the Iranian perspective, it is the United States that's pulled the plug on allowing that to be the basis for a broader opening. I think that the Islamic Republic remains open to a broader opening to the United States, but their notion of an opening is not that they simply surrender to every American demand. And, we just have a difference of view on that. In terms of, Richard Haas, I should say, full disclosure, I'm certainly not anti-Richard Haas. Both my wife and I worked for Richard when he was head of policy planning. I'll let my wife speak for herself, but I at least thought that was one of the best experiences I had working in the U.S. government. Richard was the best man at our wedding, so I'm not anti-Richard. I think he's dead wrong on this issue. I think he made a number of assertions about Iranian politics that are simply not borne out by any kind of evidence or facts, and I disagree with his policy conclusions. And I think if the U.S. government took his advice in this instance, it would be very, very bad for American interests. On the nuclear question, the bit about the additional protocol is spot on. If the United States would forget about this idea of getting Iran to abandon uranium enrichment inside Iran, which ain't ever going to happen at this point, and basically wanted to structure a nuclear deal around Iranian ratification. Iran has already signed the additional protocol but hasn't ratified it. Base it on ratification of the additional protocol, and let's talk about the kinds of verification measures that would be put in place so that we could make sure the proliferation risks associated with uranium enrichment in Iran were controlled. I think you'd have a nuclear deal in relatively short order, but that would require an actually grown-up approach on the part of the United States.
Human.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right what Flynn says about the additional Iran has already said they'll sign the additional protocol, pretty much. They have actually already signed it but not ratified it. Both the government of Khatami and Ahmadinejad have indicated numerous times that the additional protocol is not an issue, which is borne out by the people of Iran also supporting, is not an issue as long as this demand for foregoing enrichment on their soil is no longer the demand. So I don't think that's an issue. In terms of Richard Haas, I would actually I'm going to neither criticize him nor praise him. He has every right to have his opinion about whether there should be regime change or whether the United States should be actively promoting regime change or not. He has every right to feel that way. I think I would agree with Flint that it is probably dangerous for the United States to inject itself into the domestic affairs of Iran. It'll hurt the reform movement. It'll hurt Khatami. It'll hurt Mousavi. It'll hurt Karoubi. It'll be welcomed by some people. That's not, there'll be some people in Iran, including in Iran. There are people who, tear up pictures of Khamenei and Khomeini. I don't know what their numbers are, but we know that they exist. There are people who want to get rid of the Islamic Republic, and they would probably welcome help from the United States. But they are not the majority, not at this point, and they're certainly not the leaders of the Green Movement. And for people who would argue that the leaders of the Green Movement are no longer the leaders of the Green Movement, then I would suggest that they show us who the leaders will be or are. And maybe there will be in the future, but right now, the leaders are still Mousavi, Karoubi, and Khatami directly, and indirectly the support of people like Ayatollah Rafsanjani and Ayatollah Sanei and people like that. So they're still, they are still within the confines of the Islamic Republic. They're working within those confines, and they're not looking for revolution. And they're certainly not once have they asked for support from the United States, not one of them. And in fact, quite the opposite. It suggested that the United States keep its nose out of it.
Barbara.
First, to Flint's point that it's always been the United States that's backed away from Iran, that's not true. If you read my book, you will find that there have been times when the U.S. has been more forthcoming and Iran has backed away. It's been the cursed history of our two countries over the last 3 decades that we are always out of sync. Whenever the U.S. is ready, Iran is not, and whenever Iran is ready, the U.S. is not. And so in 1990, there was supposed to be a meeting in Geneva when George H.W. Bush was president. The Iranians pulled out. Under the Clinton administration's second term, a number of gestures were made toward Iran, but Khatami couldn't even bring himself to shake Clinton's hand at the UN. I mean, You
Well,
have to be
he
honest
could, but he
about-
wasn't allowed to.
You have to be honest about this. This has just been the history, and we're still stuck in this paradigm. On the question of Richard Haass, full disclosure, I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I admire Richard. I think he's a very good foreign policy thinker, and I think what he wrote was important in terms of suggesting that you can be a realist about U.S. foreign policy, but also acknowledge a very important movement that is taking place in Iran. And his proposals for the U.S. government were very modest. In fact, they're things that the U.S. is already doing to some extent. We're trying to make it easier for Iranians to evade censorship on the internet, making sure they can use proxy servers outside Iran, providing technical assistance where possible so they can get the word out, because they're not giving visas to journalists like me now to go and actually report on what's going on in the country. I think his other suggestion was that Iranian Americans should be able to send money to relatives in Iran who are struggling, people who've lost their jobs in reprisals because of the movement, and this would require lifting some restrictions that the Treasury Department now has on sending money to Iran. So these are very modest proposals. They're not trying to supplant the opposition movement by any means. They're just trying to encourage the movement.
We're right at the end. I'd love to come to you, Michael, but we're right at the end, and I want to give the opportunity to have a sort of wrap-up to our speakers and ask Human and Barbara if there's anything else you'd like to put on the table, and then give last word to Flint. I do think that it would make a lot of sense if Flint would indulge me at some point to invite Richard and even maybe Bob Kagan, who's been another big player in this, to come and have a chat about these issues, because I do think they're very important. And just to put my own cards on the table, I wrote a piece for the American Interest that was sort of grading President Obama along with others. And the original title I put on it is that in grading Obama, only Iran matters, in the sense of achieving the higher ordered strategic goals. I, too, respect the movement and what's going on the street, but the higher ordered strategic goals and demonstrating from what I consider to be a deficit power position in the world that President Obama inherited from President Bush, it's very, very important to demonstrate that you can achieve the objectives you set out for yourself, and that you can recreate American leverage in key areas. And this is where I do think, I disagree with you, Barbara, that some historical metaphors are useful, because in the case, and it's what has me very worried about China, and I'd love to get any response from China, no matter how you look at the U.S.-China situation today, the United States, to some degree, has made the decision to rob China of one of its strategic objectives, which was ongoing, smooth relations with no perturbations in the U.S. relationship, because it benefited so dramatically in other areas. So that is now being taken away, and I think it's being taken away in part because of frustration over Iran. It should be over economic issues, but I really do think it's about Iran. And it brings us back then to the question that if you need to demonstrate that you can change the way gravity works. I mean, the Israel-Palestine effort was never about Israel-Palestine. It's about robbing Iran of running room in the region. If you look at the various gestures and moves that you would make, Iran was so important and so central. And in my view, I think they got realism wrong. I mean, realism, they did it badly. They made an effort, but it didn't quite come together. But I'm very distressed that what I see happening today in U.S.-China relations, which are going to become more rocky, or maybe we're trying to shock China into moving something, may be really the closing curtain on the chances of really doing anything more broadly in either a grand bargain or even a sequenced set of deals with Iran. So I do want to put that on the table that I think that the consequences of what we're saying today are absolutely enormous for the future of U.S. power and the credibility we have globally. And we are in a position in which I think we need to demonstrate an ability to pull some rabbits out of the hat, and they're not coming out. And so I'll just wrap up there, but would like to get any closing comments from all of you. And then, those of you who want to stay later and hang out and talk to folks, you're welcome to do that. Those of you with hands, just come up and pose them personally afterward. But Barbara, any final thoughts?
I think the U.S. is, in terms of China, they're obeying the Taiwan Relations Act by sending them weapons, and Obama's finally going to meet with the Dalai Lama, which he should have done before he went to China. So I don't see. I think China remains very important. I think that relationship remains important, and I'm optimistic actually that the Chinese will sign on to some kind of sanctions resolution at the UN against Iran, despite these irritants on other issues. historical analogies are fine. It's just they're not always exact. That's all I was trying to say on that. And then you had another point on pulling a rabbit out of the hat. Yeah, it'd be great if Obama could do that, but the rabbit has to want to come out of the hat. And we cannot make, if the Iranians really want a deal, I think there are many channels and many ways in which they could convey this to the Obama administration, and as far as I know, they haven't done so.
Well, I think the Obama administration has actually been overall pretty good with respect to Iran. I don't recall President Obama himself ever accusing Iran of having a fraudulent election. I think he's protested to some degree or commented on the crackdown, and I think that there's some validity to that. I think that it is dangerous first, there's two issues here in terms of Iran and engagement with the United States. For those people who say that if Iran engages the United States, then it gives legitimacy to the Ahmadinejad government, kills the Green Movement, or kills any pro-democracy movement, I would disagree, because the only way that the United States can have any leverage over the Iranian government when it comes to human rights is to already have some form of relationship. Otherwise, we have no credibility going in. Why would the government of Iran give a damn what the United States thinks about the human rights situation in Iran when it has absolutely no relations and is about to have new sanctions imposed on it? So I think it actually hurts us to not have some kind of engagement, and human rights can always be the issue. And then we have to think about how the Iranian government, one of the problems with knowing how Iranians feel or what Iranians think about things is that we don't really have a lot of access. As Barbara pointed out, we don't have a lot of journalists, foreign journalists in Iran. The journalists who are there, some of them are my friends, are very restricted in their reporting post-election. And prior to the election, Americans weren't all that interested in what some farmer in Gilan was thinking on an average day. Nowadays, we're much more interested in what those people are thinking. The important thing to know is that a lot of those people do not have satellite TV. A lot of those people outside of the wealthier areas or outside the big cities do not have satellite, do not watch CNN. They watch Iranian state television. And when President Obama, for example, goes and gives a speech to the Muslim world from Cairo, Iranian state television is not hesitant to point out that he's doing that while there are political prisoners in jail in Cairo. So again, it goes to credibility. Where does the administration have credibility with Iran? And I think it's very important for the Obama administration, in my mind, not that I'm a politician, nor should I be giving advice to anyone, it's important for them to recognize what kind of credibility they have with Iranians, whether they're in the opposition or supporters of the Ahmadinejad government. Anyway, running out of time.
Just 2 points to close. One is that at this point in the evolution of the strategic environment in the Middle East, the United States cannot achieve any of its high-priority policy goals in the region, not in terms of Arab-Israeli peacemaking, post-conflict stabilization in Iraq and Afghanistan, curbing WMD proliferation, you name it. The United States cannot do it without a strategic opening with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Point 2, the Obama administration now is not only failing to do what it would take to achieve that kind of strategic opening, it is now using the Iran issue as an excuse for driving the Sino-American relationship into what I think is really dangerous territory for American interests. The financial crisis that broke in 2008 has underscored for the Chinese leadership that they are, first of all, certainly more free to pursue their own interests in places like Iran, even when pursuing those interests runs against American policy preferences, and I can cite you a ton of data points to back up that proposition. But the Obama administration is now actually giving the Chinese incentives to use the kind of financial wherewithal they have, not just to expand their own sphere for autonomous action in the world, but actually perhaps to hurt American interests. I just point out today, quoted in the FT, a senior Chinese foreign ministry official saying it was sort of inexplicable to him that the United States would be driving Sino-American relations in such a negative direction while there's still a serious economic crisis going on in the United States. You figure out what that could mean, and you figure out if you think that's a really smart way to conduct U.S. foreign policy toward China. Thank you.
Thank you. Flint is nothing if not direct and blunt. Thank you. I want to thank Stephen Cole in particular for what he
Yes.
did. You know, the program on international policy attitudes is just an outstanding reservoir of some of the most important international polling and research, and I've watched the organization since it's grown. I'm so happy that when you get a new set of data, you often come over to New America, do it, and check out its worldpolicyopinion.org as well. Worldpublicopinion.org, which is an outstanding site, which I was on yesterday, and I think it's linked to our site, so do check it out. Thank you for provoking this interesting discussion and taking it, because I do think that it's important to have these sorts of debates and discussion. People are going to see some of this differently, but it's good to get data up and to sort of wrestle with it and wrestle with opinion. I wrestle with these questions every day and learned a great deal. I know many of you had questions out there. I want to thank the folks that are online as well who don't even get to get their hands up. I'll invite those of you, we'll hang out a little bit here, who want to bring questions up front. Just come up and talk to us so we can be responsive. So thanks very much for coming. Please thank Flint Leverett. Come on,
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for coming. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Your book's going to be out in September?
I think so, yeah.
A new one?
Yeah.
What's this one called?
Yeah, I told us democracy.
Oh.